There we go. Okay, we're currently recording. If anybody doesn't want to appear on camera or kind of speak out loud, please just feel free to post things in the chat. So Saska is a senior lecturer at the School of Environment Education and Development at the University of Manchester, and she does research and policy work at the intersection of energy, precarity, and gender, with a wider interest in the political governance and contestation of social and environmental injustices. She's done a wide range of research in different countries such as Greece, UK, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria. The list goes on. She's had a research had a kind of wide range of impact on policies and strategies across Europe. We're really lucky to have her. I'm sure everybody here has read some of Saska's work in the past, and we're looking forward to hearing about some of the stuff that she's working on now. Neil, we know some of you who've had kind of dealings with the Energy Geographies Research Group in the past more than familiar with Neil, who was the former chair before myself. He's a social geographer and lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, and is broadly interested in how the social and physical environment has unequal impacts on people's health and well-being, and looking at the connections of this with energy and questions of inequality and social and environmental justice. He's particularly well known for his work on energy poverty and deprivation, and is working currently with the Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions, CREDS, the UK kind of research body, on the fuel and transport poverty during the UK energy transition. I would thoroughly recommend having a look at the CREDS website to go and see kind of some of that research in action. So we're very lucky to be joined by both Neil and Saska today. Really looking forward to hearing more about this current work, and please give everyone a warm welcome. Give them a warm welcome, and kind of ask them lots of questions at the end. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to the two of you. Thank you very much again for joining us. Take it away.
Yes, I'm just trying to share the slides. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to see some friends and colleagues from the University of Manchester, but also from some other universities. I'm especially happy to see the co-author of the papers, or one of the papers that we're going to present today, which is John Phillips. John, thank you for joining us today. And I feel much more comfortable now when you're around talking about our paper. I would also like to thank Peter for organizing this this amazing series of webinars on gender and energy. And just at the beginning, I would like to say that it's really wonderful to be able to co-present with Neil, because just for a bit of context, Neil and I have started working together in 2013 when Neil came. We both actually started working at the University of Manchester, and we started working on the ERC funded Evaluate project, which was led by Stefan Buzarowski, but we also had Sergio Tirado Herrero and Harriet Thompson as our colleagues involved in the project too. Neil and I have also co-taught a course unit titled Energy, Society and Space, and we both have been interested in how energy can reproduce different types of energy injustices, and we have approached energy deprivation as one form of a socio-ecological injustice. Our work has been informed by theorizations and discussions by energy geographers, political ecology scholars, and critical feminist thinkers. So Neil will give us a bit more of a context of our talk today. So Neil, I will just go here to structure.
Yeah, thanks, Saska. Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks as well to Pete for the invitation and the introduction. So it's nice to see you all here. So this is just an outline of what we're going to be talking about. So to begin with, Saska and I will both give a bit of a background context to the presentation and some of our sort of theoretical starting points. Then I'm going to talk about a case study based on a paper that we co-authored, which was looking at the everyday experiences of energy poverty and how these are often gendered. Then I'll pass on to Saska. She's going to talk about a more recent paper that she did with John Phillips, who's, Saska says, is here, which is using this energy precarity framing, so still looking at gender, but a slightly different angle. And then we'll finish not so much with some conclusions, but some maybe questions about what next and where could gender and energy poverty research go in the future. Yeah, so next slide, please, Saska. I'm going to be Chris Whitty and ask for next slides. Okay, so starting points then. So this is just some background to say why this is important. So some stats. There's about 1.1 billion people globally that have no access to electricity. If we look at the European Union, which is a region, thankfully, most people do have access to electricity, but even there's about 37 million people that report not being able to keep their home adequately warm, which is about 7.3% of the population. But if you look at certain countries, that percentage is much higher. We look at what's going on now. So recently we've seen these dramatic increases in the wholesale gas prices, which is going to feed into rising consumer bills. And in the UK case, it's predicted that average energy bills might rise by as much as 70% in April, which is going to have, I mean, potentially devastating impacts in terms of actually really deepening the number of people living in hardship and the number of people that can't keep their home adequately warm. So next slide, please, Saska. So yes, so what we're talking about here then is this idea of energy deprivation or energy poverty. So this is really the central concept of one of the central concepts that our presentation is based on. So energy deprivation, also known as energy poverty or fuel poverty in the UK context. More recently, people have talked about energy vulnerability, energy precarity, as Saska uses, and in the French context or in the USA context, people often talk about energy insecurity. And so there's lots of different terms that you can use. Some of them have different histories. So fuel poverty comes from the UK context, really has its roots back in the 1970s around concerns about rising energy prices. Energy poverty initially was originally mobilized in development studies, and it was focused on this issue of a lack of access to electricity in the global south. But what we see more recently is we've had scholarship that's been trying to integrate these different terms, right? And these two kind of bodies of scholarship, the fuel poverty, energy poverty. And Saska and her co-author, Stefan Buzarowski, they came up with this nice definition in 2015. And they basically said that all these different kind of labels that we use to describe energy deprivation, they all ultimately come down to a common condition, which they describe as an inability to attain a socially and materially necessitated level of energy services. So that's the definition. Basically, when we talk about energy poverty, energy deprivation in this paper, that's the definition we're following. So it's basically sorry, Saska, one more thing, just to say as well, energy poverty. So it's a form of material deprivation. You can't use the energy services that you need to. And I think importantly, Saska and I would both agree that it's often framed as well, not just as a kind of unfortunate event, but it's a form of injustice, right? So next slide, please, Saska. So energy poverty or energy deprivation is often framed as a kind of domestic issue. So the dominant framing, the way it's represented, is that it's an issue that affects households, and households are kind of positioned as these homogeneous sort of entities that experience and are vulnerable to energy poverty. Which, you know, lots of work takes this framing. There's some great work that's come from it. But what we would argue is that this framing ignores the potential for within home differences and power dynamics and inequalities that occur within a home, and how those power dynamics and the domestic roles of individual household members, how they actually influence the experience of energy poverty. So really, I suppose that kind of gap is where our research that we've done and what we talk about today comes in, because clearly as well, gender is one of those central aspects of domestic power relations, right? The home remains one of the most gendered spheres in most societies around the world. The home is an important location for the reproduction of femininities and masculinities. Next slide, please, Saska. Okay, so the energy, poverty and gender nexus. So there's a growing body of research, I would say, on the energy, poverty and gender intersections. So actually, for quite a long time, research and activism in the global south has recognized and it's studied gendered inequalities and the often disproportionate impacts that are experienced by women due to a lack of energy access. So, for example, you have the Energy network, which was formed in 1995. It's an international network of female researchers that campaigns for gender equal energy access. But in the global north context, the link between energy poverty and gender inequality remains under-researched. And in the past few years, we've started to see a bit more research that's started to look at that. For example, the research by Marielle Feenstra, Joy Clancy. But I think they would probably agree with us that it's still a relatively new field, and maybe especially that there's relatively little qualitative research, right, that really looks into how gender impacts the lived experiences, the everyday lived experiences of energy poverty. Next slide, please, Saska. And I think this is you now, so I'll pass back over.
Yes. So this photo, I took this photo at one exhibition, which was on energy poverty. And you can see some fantastic pictures and photos of mostly women and children who live in some dreadful conditions. Unfortunately, what actually the audience wasn't able, or the visitors weren't able to understand, is the story or the context of in which these people live, or their agencies. So basically, they have been shown as just neutral, vulnerable people who live in dreadful conditions, without agency and without a bit more of context. And here, I mean, the placing of women in the domestic context and in relation to energy demand is embedded basically in the historical construction of gendered energy roles, as it's shown here in these advertisements for different domestic energy services and appliances. So, but the domestic, we would argue, or our homes, do not exist in vacuum, but they are permeable, as, for example, my dear researcher and colleague Harry Larrington Spencer would argue. Also, our homes are not our homes and the domestic realm is situated in the broader urban fabric and more broadly in our society. In line with many colleagues and academics, we would argue that homes affect and are affected by urban circulations of resources such as water and energy. We would also add that the mode of energy governance affect the reproduction of what is known as domestic comfort and the feeling of hominess. Homes are not only mirrors of our society, but they are also active political ecological spaces and sites where broader political projects of identities, belonging, and nation buildings are effectuated.
Okay, so
Neil, back to you.
Yes, so for the next part, what I'll do now is I'm going to discuss some empirical findings from a recent paper that Saska and I published that really tried to engage with some of those debates that we were just talking about and tried to address maybe that gap around the lived experience of energy poverty and gender. So this was a paper that was based from interviews with households that were experiencing energy deprivation. So it's from 3 cities. It was from Gdańsk in Poland, Prague in the Czech Republic, and Thessaloniki in Greece. So as part of this paper, it was based on a sample of 66 households that we interviewed as part of that research. Some of them were interviewed twice. I can't remember the exact number now, not everyone, but some of them were. So probably about 100 interviews overall. And I think one thing to mention actually about this paper is that when we did the interviews, they weren't conducted with actually gender in mind as kind of one of the topics that we were wanting to explore. So we didn't probe or we didn't question specifically about gender issues. It wasn't really an aim that we were trying to look for. But what we noticed when we did the data analysis was that gender almost emerged organically or inductively from our analysis based on what many interviewees were talking about. And gender actually seemed to be a central element to how energy deprivation was experienced in the home, which is kind of what led us down this path, basically. So that motivated us to analyse further. And we wrote this paper, which was seeking to address the following aims. So it was about understand how gender relations and inequalities mediate the everyday experiences of energy poverty, and also to elucidate and think about how these inequalities are instrumental in the wider reproduction of gendered vulnerabilities. Okay, so the first aspect of the findings relates to this idea of gendered household practices and how energy poverty impacted those everyday practices. So many previous studies, some of you will be familiar with this, have shown that people living in energy deprivation, they tend to adapt their everyday routines, their everyday practices to try and cope with their situation. So for example, they'll reduce the usage of their heating, they'll change how much they use their appliances and when. Basically, they try and carefully ration their consumption to try and keep their home warm, to try and keep their energy bills low. And we found our findings echoed that, right? We found people were still doing this in all the cases that we looked at. But what we found related to gender was that often the responsibility for undertaking those kinds of altered practices and those energy saving behaviors was often highly gendered, right? It was often feminized and it was often undertaken by women. So examples included using a broom, deliberately choosing to use a broom rather than vacuuming to save energy, being very careful with the lights, sometimes hand washing clothes rather than using the washing machine. So often these sorts of practices, they involved great care, they could be very time consuming, and they involved a degree of physical and mental effort and repetition. And I think that's really evident here in this quote we have from Hannah, that was living in Gdansk. And what the quote there talks about is how every day, throughout the day, Hannah would very diligently ensure that her home's radiators were correctly adjusted in order to minimize the consumption. And this is something that she would go through every single day in every room in the house. In other cases, we had one respondent who reported she would spend her weekends conducting laundry and cooking in order to take advantage of off-peak tariffs. And at the weekend, she had no time for leisure because she was spending it doing household chores. So although she didn't complain about that situation, it was arguably problematic. Although we also had cases where this kind of gendering of practices was also interpreted more positively as a kind of form of domestic power. So it was actually acknowledged as well by some male household members who described that their female partners were the ones that were in charge of this aspect of the home. And they were the ones that regulated and managed the domestic energy consumption. Next slide, please, Saska. Okay, so that was everyday practices and sort of behavioural adaptations. In contrast, measures to try and adapt or respond to energy poverty through energy efficiency measures, so through things like, installing wall or roof insulation, purchasing more energy efficient appliances, these tended to be seen as sort of appropriately masculine roles, and therefore they were typically undertaken by men. So in the quote here from Milan in Prague, he shared an apartment with his two flatmates. And he describes in this quote with pride how he negotiated with the landlord the change of the old inefficient boiler with the new one that improved the thermal comfort of the flat. And there were other cases like this as well, where basically any kind of energy saving measure that involves sort of buying new stuff or making a kind of energy efficiency DIY improvement to your home, that was typically seen as kind of a masculine endeavor. So really what these gender roles reflect are what are socially constructed gender norms and expectations of wider society, in which kind of routine reproductive household activities or housework and care work are constructed as feminine and home maintenance as masculine. So really, this helps to reproduce those wider gender divisions of labour. So on this slide here, however, having said that, we also had a few cases where attempts to live with and resist energy poverty had actually led to a reconfiguration of those traditional gender roles, right? So in some mixed sex households, it was actually the female partner who took a stronger interest in and had a greater knowledge of energy efficiency, particularly relating to domestic appliances, but actually in a few cases into actually undertaking those retrofits or DIY changes to the home itself, to the building fabric. So in the case here of Zofia, she was living at home with an adult son in his 20s. She was perhaps in the most severe energy poverty of everyone we interviewed in Gdansk. And she describes how she's undertaken many DIY repairs to try and make her home warmer. So we call these, or we refer to them as moments of rupture, because they illustrate practices that aren't in line with those kind of expected traditional norms of gendered behavior. And they actually illustrate the social construction of gender roles, right? These aren't essentialist binaries, these changes in behavior due to biological differences. It's about social construction. And they also give us a glimpse into alternative imaginaries and possibilities, and they challenge those kinds of essentialist stereotypes. Next slide, please, Saska. Okay, so that's the gendered practices. The other aspect of energy poverty that we found to be impacted by gender inequality was this idea of gendered emotional labor. So again, there's a strong body of research that talks about how energy poverty can really impact people emotionally and have some quite severe impacts on people's emotional and their mental well-being. So as I was just saying, women in our sample were typically responsible for rationing the energy consumption through changes to their practices. And that itself was often a kind of mentally draining activity to remember to do this so regimentally every single day. But also that was worsened by the fact that such rationing was often in tension with other domestic responsibilities that these women were supposed to undertake, especially in terms of social expectations around being a good caregiver for children or dependents. And these kind of caregiving roles were again ones that were typically undertaken by women. So for example, limiting energy or heating consumption was actually not always conducive to the health and well-being of your dependents, of your children or other dependents in the house. And that kind of tension could often lead to feelings of shame or guilt, or this feeling that I'm not doing good enough because you're not able to fulfill either of the expectations that are placed on you adequately. So in the case here of Daphne, we have the quote, she was living with and caring for her ill mother in Thessaloniki, and they were also experiencing energy poverty. So Daphne had taken measures to try and cut their heating usage, to try and save money on the energy bills, to make sure they could afford them. But then the result of that was that she feared that she'd actually ended up making her mother, who she was supposed to be caring for, ill, because it got extremely cold in the house. So it really exemplifies the difficulty of negotiating those two kinds of sets of expectations between reducing consumption on the one hand and being a good caregiver on the other. And just to finish on this slide, Saska, before I pass back, oh no, there's one more, isn't there? But yeah, last bit on this slide. So this echoes critical feminist thinking around the feminization of care and the ways that society creates expectations and norms around whose duty it is to care. So caregiving is typically feminized, but when this is in tension with pressures to reduce energy consumption, this heightens the potential for energy poverty to cause emotional harm. However, last point, sorry, men were perhaps less frequently exposed to the emotional impacts of energy poverty, but it's also important to recognize that nonetheless, they still encountered this, especially, for example, around the issue of undertaking DIY alterations. This could be a pressured or taxing experience, and there was a sense that men often felt a kind of duty over the integrity of the home. And if there was problems with the built fabric, again, that could sort of be taken as a sense that they weren't fulfilling their expected roles. So next slide, please, Saska. So just to sum up this paper then, so we found that energy poverty is a highly gendered problem, and experiences of energy poverty are interlinked with and shaped by these broader patterns and processes of gender inequality. And at the same time, it helps to reconstitute those broader patterns as well. More hopefully, our research also suggests that disruptive events and forms of hardship, such as energy poverty, can potentially reveal the socially contingent nature of traditional gender roles and potentially challenge essentially stereotypes and dichotomies. One thing we think new research, following on really from what we did, could maybe pay more attention to household recruitment and actually go beyond only looking at nuclear families. Because I think we both recognize that one of the weaknesses maybe of this study was that most of the participants in our sample kind of fit the traditional nuclear family kind of model, you know, heterosexual couple with children, etc. So actually having a more diverse sample that's maybe looking at different kinds of household compositions would potentially be interesting to see how gender plays out in those cases. But at that, I will leave it and I will pass on to Saska to talk about the second paper.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for presenting our paper. So this part of the talk, as I mentioned, is based on a paper that was published together with my colleague, John Phillips, who is here today. Hello, John, again. And this paper is one of the outcomes of the ESRC-funded project Urbatrans on urban energy transformations in South Africa that was led by Federico Caprotti, and both John and I were involved in. The first aim of this paper was to develop understanding of how precarity renders some people vulnerable to suffering through socio-material processes, those that operate through relationships between the human and the non-human world. We situate our analysis in South Africa, a country with similarities and important distinctions to the northern economies where precarity has been primarily developed and deployed. We explore how energy precarity is reproduced or destabilized through socio-material relations, including intersecting materialities of housing, tenure, infrastructure, and planning, the uneven management of energy supply and demand, and subject formation. Our second aim was to integrate the infrastructural politics of energy access and supply with the gendered and racialized dynamics of energy demand. We use precarity here, in this case, to explore how gender and race are enlisted in a municipal energy policy as a development project that represents low-income Black women simultaneously as a vulnerable demographic and a latent entrepreneurial force that can be instrumentalized in policy. In this talk, I will just focus on the gendered and racialized aspect of discussed in the paper. So all of these arguments and the paper in general is based on 42 interviews that were conducted by John Phillips through snowball sampling to select interviews, different stakeholders, and also it was this data was complemented by observations from 2 workshops that were organized by Sustainable Energy Africa and in some of the municipalities, and basically both those interviews and workshops took place in Johannesburg and Polokwane. So as I mentioned in the introduction of this paper, in this paper we used energy precarity as a concept, mainly to focus, to shift the focus from individual households onto like more collective agencies, and to look at energy deprivation a bit beyond the home. And in this case, I would just mention that energy precarity draws attention to the market mechanisms used to govern energy vulnerable people. And it's basically an addition and complements the energy fuel poverty and energy vulnerability frameworks. In our paper with John, we defined energy precarity, or we advanced the understanding of energy precarity as a politically induced, gendered, racialized, and geographically uneven process that operates across multiple scales and through the spheres of energy production, distribution, and consumption. So basically what we try to do with this paper also is a bit to unsettle the Northern-centric understanding of precarity, because precarity has been discussed, developed and deployed as a single phenomenon, and basically predominantly used used, and I said developed in the global north. But the same kind of concept has been used in a way to unify, or even to make some broader arguments about precarity in different geographies, and not necessarily in the global north. So there have been different calls in terms of approaching precarity as a concept based on conditions and empirics from the global south. So in that sense, basically we try to address some of that gap, and we support the argument that was developed, for example, by Lee and Kaufman and other colleagues who would argue that precarity can only be the result of experimentations and encounters and through experiences. So in terms of the intersectional energy politics, basically the gendered impacts of energy deprivation have been widely recognized, yet many policies and analysis mobilize a problematic binary. And as I mentioned, that binary has been the feminization of energy poverty versus the heroic entrepreneurialism of women. Along those lines, Chitonge would argue that advocacy has shifted from gender-sensitive energy planning to a narrow class-based project of promoting the growth of elite businesswomen in the energy sector. In part, this argument reflects post-apartheid policy of promoting a Black capitalist class to increase control of core sectors of the South African economy, including energy. So the next slides are basically slides informed by our empirical evidence. And this one is about gender inequalities and how gender inequalities are shaped through traditional gender roles. So this is a quote by a director of an NGO. And I will read this quote because it's quite an emblematic a quote that illustrates the situation in terms of traditional gendered roles and how they tend to be reproduced. So open quote. There are many female-headed households in both urban and rural areas, but many men and women are employed in the city. Even in households where men are present and working, it is often the women who control the household energy. When the electricity needs to be bought, they're the ones with the power and the respect to make those decisions, or whether they are cooking with solar or the hot bag. You can see a picture of a woman using the mentioned hot bag. However, they may not be able to make the decisions over the money to be used. They are the ones that are home and also have to travel distance to buy paraffin or coal, sit with kids to do homework, end quote. So here it's important to recognize that providing material resources does not necessarily affect power relations within households. Rather, gender divisions of labor can be reproduced through household interventions that treat gender as an individual level category. So many interventions have been undertaken and made, especially in terms of energy efficiency, but also access to the grid, or the provision of different off-grid solutions in a way to help women. But this is common with the introduction of energy efficient or labor-saving household technology that are intended to reduce the cost and burden of household tasks. However, since grid supply is unaffordable for poor households, the security and quality of service provided by off-grid technologies can be greater, while the gendered and racialized health risks of dirty fuels that otherwise meet energy demand are reduced. There have been many infrastructural promises made, and we found that throughout the interviews that were undertaken as part of the Urban Trans project as well. And what we have found out is that the introduction of new technologies can also induce energy vulnerabilities. Off-grid solar home systems installed in informal settlements can often improve service provision, but typically do not meet all household energy needs. Sufficient for lighting, but not cooking, these incremental solutions may form part of an inclusive energy policy for poor households, beyond the limitations of grid supply. Yet, celebratory accounts appeared at odds with the gender empowerment, where new technologies formalize the flexibility that women exercise when required to choose between material needs. So basically, women have been faced by almost impossible choices. So a bit of energy sometimes has been provided to them, but not enough energy to basically meet all the necessarily energy needs. The help that has been provided is often individualized, and that help has come with different and some high expectations. So, for example, we go back to the quote, one of the previous quotes, and this one shows that remedies are often individualized in effort to unleash the productive potential of energy and women's labor. Expectations of flexibility and adaptability are embedded in rhetorical support for the entrepreneurialism of the poor, yet they can exploit the capacities of women and induce vulnerabilities, as I mentioned. In municipal policy making, the entrepreneurial activity of women in poor neighborhoods has been expressed as both a means and an end, where development effectiveness relies upon identifying entrepreneurial individuals with key characteristics. And the second quote here also shows that policy focus on entrepreneurialism aims to tap into unutilized energies of young people and women in low-income neighborhoods. It is not divorced from the state as facilitator, but it is associated with common assumptions of a post-apartheid milieu in which Black low-income citizens have grown dependent on the state, and where channels of distribution are actually maligned. Flexibility and adaptability seem to be the key expectations, and they are already evident in communal and individual strategies by which women negotiate urban life. So those actually characteristics and practices are already there, yet daily improvisations is not the signifier of entrepreneurial activity invoked by the municipality. Different logics of entrepreneurialism are evident in corporate business models and those of poor urban residents, which caution against an instrumental approach to entrepreneurial subject formation. So this picture is one of the pictures that we took as part of the project. And here I just would like to say that the feminization of poverty is likely to remain a significant narrative in mobilizing support for gender-sensitive energy planning, which activists have struggled to institutionalize in post-apartheid energy policy. Yet, well-meaning support for community-based solutions to energy poverty can exploit the flexibility and ability of women to adopt and balance responsibilities for social reproduction and income generation. This process of precarity places responsibility with women who may have few resources and limited power over the processes that render them and other vulnerable to energy deprivation. Under these conditions, strategies designed to reduce energy deprivation can actually reinforce energy precarity. Binary narratives of victimization and heroic entrepreneurialism obscure the causes of energy deprivation, leaving gendered and racialized social relations unchallenged, unfortunately. As a mechanism of government, energy interventions have unevenly embedded market forces into the lives and homes of residents to create responsible subjects. As we explore next, these rationalities produce indeterminate encounters of market forces and socio-reproductions, where possibilities to contest gender power relations are not foreclosed. In terms of precarity, and because we said that here in this paper we use precarity as a concept, precarity, we used it as a process or precarity in flux, as we called it in our paper. So it's not only used as a way to describe the process, but it's also used as a starting point to unpack some of the modes of resistance and how people actually resist in a way those processes of precarizations. So our question is, how then might resistance and struggle with energy precarity be shaped to challenge gendered and racialized social relations? So John and I have argued that precarity offers insights into how vulnerabilities are contested as a shared condition with potential for broader systemic struggle. We explore strategies of spectacular resistance and everyday practices as experimentation with how energy and infrastructures are constitutive of gender and racial inequalities. So, based on our research, we have actually identified different types of struggles and different types of protests. But it's worth mentioning that many extra legal means of accessing essential energy services have their roots in appetite struggle and payment boycott. Different types of protests have been registered, such as bypassing household meters and illegally connecting unelectrified informal settlements to adjacent power lines. Also, there have been different types of organized resistance to the installation of tamper-proof metering technologies or accessing energy services in the homes of others. So, sorry. Struggles and resistance in the global south tend to be romanticized, though as Anyana Roy and other academics would argue. Analysis of precarity also cautions against romanticizations or romanticizing coping strategies or celebrating resistance uncritically. Many can be characterized as ingenious, subversive means by which poor and non-poor people meet their energy needs without payment and challenge the commodification of social reproduction. So there is something that has been called almost like as class citizenship solidarity, and this is a quote of a member of the anti-capitalist group Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, a scholar activist, who has said that other groups engage with that argument, calling for a more affordable rate. We say, no, we're not paying. We use global arguments that energy is a public good, a national argument that energy is a right. We use moral and social economic arguments, then working class arguments that workers produce energy, so why should they pay twice? As socialists, we make the argument as a transitional one. We envision a world where people get what they need. This also quote is a symbolic or illustrates some broader terms or broader trends, in relation to how energy deprivation has been resisted. So, for example, the movement called the right to energy, and in which, for example, energy deprivation is not seen as a way that should be used to stigmatize households or to responsibilize households, but as something that should be available to all people, and all people should have access to affordable energy. So in terms of some of the summaries or some of the summative points, we can say that based on this paper that as one dimension of hyper-precarity, and hyper-precarity is used often to reflect on the different types of precarities that are used that actually can characterize a specific context. So in this case can be housing precarity, can be also, for example, climate precarity, can be energy precarity. So when we have all those different labor precarity, gender, race precarity, all of those, when we combine them, we can talk about this situation of hyper precarity in South Africa. Energy is related with racialized and gendered exclusions from labor markets, as well as inequitable systems of housing, tenure, planning, and urban form. So analytical frameworks, in that case, we would argue, are required that account for multiple processes of insecurity, inflexibility, and informalization by which precarity can be reproduced or destabilized. We made this point because very often, for example, in the global, or in some countries, in what we tend to call the global north, processes of informalization have been seen as key triggers of producing or reproducing different types of precarity. But in different contexts, it's not only the processes of informalization, but it can be also the processes of formalization. Gender, energy, and race have become a development project in which empowerment of women is individualized and instrumentalized through processes of subject formation associated with productivity, commercialization, and entrepreneurialism. And this, again, the role of precarity as a concept to kind of to grasp those market conditions as well, and the capitalist thinking around deprivation. Gendered and racialized relations of energy production and consumption, unfortunately, often remain largely unchallenged. And here we have a quote by Berlanda and Povinelli in terms of precarity, and I would like to add actually this part of the presentation with the quote, which says, "The most unbearable precarity is in the radical individuality sold as liberal freedom, where people imagine that competition is what's natural, while relations that build worlds are exceptional," end quote. Because I'm not going to say much more here, and it would be lovely to have a discussion afterwards. And plus we have some more food for thought just at the end of the presentation. And Neil, if you don't mind, I'm just going to change the slide now and you can present.
Oh, right, okay, this is me, is it? Yes, so these were just, I think we were just looking at this as sort of based on what we've just presented, sort of future avenues for research. So one of the things relates to this idea of intersectionality, and I think maybe Saska's presentation started to unpack that a bit more than what I was able to do and we did in the first paper. But the way that kind of gender, maybe more research that investigates the way that gender interconnects with other axes of social difference, such as ethnicity, race, and class, or even differences geographically. That could be between nations, but also between urban and rural regions in the same nation. Also, this potential gap around sometimes research on gender, there's occasionally a conflation between gender and sex and not always being clear on what the differences between those are, but also when you do talk about gender, and we did this in our paper, we were talking about this, we still do this, and it's very hard to break out of this thinking of seeing gender as this kind of binary between masculine and feminine, as if that's the only two possible genders, right? So research into gender and the intersection of energy poverty that maybe tries to look beyond seeing gender as just this kind of masculine feminine binary, and where might that take us, what new insights might be revealed from that. And then Saska, the last bullet point there, I think maybe that was one you added. I don't know if you want to say something around that.
I mean, this is in relation to how, for example, energy deprivation tends to be internalized and is based off self-discipline. And this argument is made in relation to housing, for example, precarity based by Alex Vasudevan. So the idea is basically, instead of responsibilizing households for suffering in energy deprivation, to talk and to try and address some of the systemic and structural conditions that actually can lead to energy deprivation and more people to suffer, from energy deprivation. I would also add here that even when we talk about men and women, it's not only in terms of It's not in terms of their biological characteristics. It's based on social construction, social constructs. And even when we talk about the feminization of poverty, that doesn't mean that feminization of poverty is only about women, but actually the feminization of poverty creates a situation in which many people, many different groups can suffer, and something that has been seen as exclusively, for example, for let's say for women. And here we can talk about different ethnic minority groups, or we can talk about migrants. We can talk about people which don't have regulated, for example, citizenship. So the feminization of energy poverty in this case is really about the different types of energy injustices and how people deal with those injustices. So yeah. To be honest, I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I can see that in the chat there are like 18 comments or something, but I haven't been able to check them because I've been sharing my screen. But thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Saska and Neil. And I see a few hand clap emojis there. Yes, thank you. I think I probably represent everyone in saying that that was amazing. Really, really interesting. I think Jess, you're going to field questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. I keep losing your audio on and off, Pete, so I don't know if that's just me or whether other people have had the same experience, but hopefully people can hear me okay. So thank you very much, Neil and Saska. That was an amazing presentation. I feel like I've got a really long reading list to go away with now, which is nice. And there's been quite a few questions already in the chat. So I'll maybe invite people, if they want to ask them directly in a moment. But I'd encourage other people as well to either add questions to the chat or to put your hand up, or please do feel free just to speak up as well. But if we start in the chat, I know, Lorianne, you asked a question, you were asking about references, paper references to an early slide about homes being an active political space. So I don't know if you wanted to add any context to that question or anything else you wanted to say, or whether we...
No, I was just taking notes and I missed the slide, like it changed too fast, and I was interested in reading that paper, and I didn't get who the authors were for that one.
Yeah, we could provide because we didn't have a reference list actually, we put but it's bad practice, you know. If my students have done this, at the end, but so we've got the in-text citations, but we haven't in the references, but we can provide one. I think a lot of them actually are in either of those two papers are probably in there, but yeah, we can happy to provide one, I think.
Perfect, thank you. Also, thank you very much for the presentation. I feel like I'm fangirling right now because I've read all of your papers of both of you, and it's very exciting to listen to you and talk to you. So thank you so much.
It's worth saying as well that obviously the recording will go on the website, so that will then have the slides if people want to go back and refer to any of the slides. Helen, you asked a couple of questions and you referred to some of your own work as well, so it'd be really nice if you could ask your question and maybe give us a bit of background on some of the things you're drawing on as well.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering to what extent you spoke about reconfiguration of gender norms and women taking a greater role or greater interest in maybe some of the more capital or physical interventions that you can make in the home around energy efficiency interventions, for example. And I was wondering to what extent you found agree or disagree. And I think, Neil, you then went on to explain some of this just after I'd sent the question, which was whether that interest, that greater interest in aspects of energy that we might traditionally associate with the masculine or with men's interest, was actually being driven by traditional gender norms, such as the kind of a greater role in terms of caring for children, or feeling a greater need to provide care and comfort in the home. And if a means of doing that is through improving the domestic energy efficiency, or harder measures in the home through interventions, whether that reconfiguration was kind of paradoxically actually being driven by traditional gender norms. And then the follow-on question was, we did some research in Tamworth, which was looking at replacing old, really inefficient electric storage heaters with a gas connection and first-time gas central heating in homes of low-income households. And when we were speaking to the families beforehand, we found experiences of, we called it the tyranny of the small stuff. So this idea that coping with fuel poverty is actually a huge drain, kind of mentally and psychologically, coping with, having to deal with tiny little thing, little kind of tiny practices in the home that would occupy their time and mental space in a way that it might not those who don't struggle with energy. And some of the things that we spoke about, or some of the issues that emerged, particularly among the women that we spoke to, was this idea of not being able to fulfill their role as a good mother, or what a good mother would, be able to do or provide for the family and children. And one of the issues that came up was this being able to provide a roast dinner, and that came after the intervention. So we were talking about, the different habitual practices in the home and how people use different spaces in the home, and we got into the subject of dinner and meal times, and this idea that she could now afford to buy a joint of meat on a Sunday for a traditional kind of British roast dinner, which she wasn't able to do before. And so I was just wondering whether, because we've spoken a lot about how the experience of energy poverty can either reinforce or reconfigure gender norms, but I was wondering whether you'd encountered any evidence that the way that we intervene, make interventions in homes, also reinforces or indeed might reconfigure those traditional gender norms. So yeah, it was just a thought.
Yeah, an interesting one though. Saska, do you want to go?
You go first and then I will add.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so I'll take the questions in reverse, Helen, if that's all right. So the second one about whether interventions to kind of, so these are like, you mean like interventions to kind of try and mitigate energy poverty or reduce energy poverty,
yeah,
whether they could reinforce or challenge gender roles. A really good question. It's a difficult one to answer from the research that we did, at least from my recollection. I think because when I was talking about kind of energy efficiency improvements, these, to the best of my knowledge, these weren't kind of ones where, there'd been a payment for an installer to come in using a sort of energy poverty support scheme like we might expect in the UK, and then they come in and they do some improvements. Most of the kind of energy efficiency measures, at least as I remember, were more these kind of DIY ad hoc type interventions. So, sort of home installed wall insulation on the inside of your wall, other kinds of maybe, so the actual effectiveness of that, I mean, I'm sure it does make some difference in terms of your home being slightly warmer, but whether it's sufficient to take you out of energy poverty, I don't think that was really the case for most of the people that we spoke to. So it was different. And also, we didn't interview them before the intervention. It was like we interviewed them and the intervention had already taken place. So we couldn't see what were the gender power dynamics before and then how did they change afterwards. So yes, so for various reasons, I don't think that we could probably give a concrete answer on that, although I think it's a super interesting thing to think about as like for future research. And then I'll quickly answer the first question, Saska, or do you want to come in now?
No, go ahead. And I'm just taking some notes. I'm just, yeah. Okay. If you don't mind,
Sure, yeah,
otherwise I can jump in.
And then the first question was, so this idea of women taking a greater role around energy efficiency and this sort of DIY repairs, whether that was driven about concerns about impact on dependents and children and things like this. Yeah, again, a great point. And actually, yes, that was partly it, basically. So the cases the few cases where we found that happening, it tended to be the more severe cases of energy poverty. So cases where people were sort of spending more than 30 or 40% of their income on their energy costs, or their home was really cold. But also in cases, well, there was at least one case, the example I gave there was the case where there was the dependent. So it was a woman living with her adult son who was sort of in his early 20s, but anyone that's lived with their parents into adulthood knows that those kind of parent-child relations never really change even when you hit 18 or whatever. So yeah, there was definitely that kind of motivation behind what she was doing, and it was about a concern for sort of taking care for her son. He was sometimes at university, sometimes coming back home. So there was this sense that when he was at home, she wanted him to be able to study and enjoy spending time and being at home while he was away from university. So yeah, did that kind of answer, Helen, the first question?
Yeah, really interesting, and thank you for the presentation. It was kind of raised a few questions about, you know, the kind of research that we've done, that we've not really kind of considered it in these terms, but also provided a lot of food for thought and how we might consider these power relationships, not just in terms of gender, but in other types of social inequality as well.
I would just add two things here. The first one is, Neil actually explained a bit the context of our research, because Evaluate tried to actually work with people who were already in a way recognized as energy vulnerable or energy poor. So all of those strategies developed were in a way almost like coping strategies to deal with the situation. And the second thing, for example, the case study in Greece, the research was undertaken just at the end of the economic crisis. So many, again, of the practices that were developed were they were just developed under those circumstances, under the circumstances of austerity and this kind of deep economic crisis, during which the energy prices went up, and the household incomes went really down. So basically, that was kind of the basic context in which we undertook our research. But there is something else about this energy efficiency, and what we found out, for example, from another project that was undertaken in Manchester, is that very often when these kind of energy efficiency technologies or interventions are made, they are made as part of different projects and strategies and plans with a start date and an end date. And what happens afterwards is the problem with repairs, maintenance, and those actually activities that are after, that actually can happen after the end of the projects, or the interventions can actually create different types of vulnerabilities, because many people just felt like they're just left on their own, and they didn't know how to deal with the situation. So there is quite a lot of that. But it was interesting how this kind of the moment of crisis, again, it's very topical, isn't it? Because we have this cyclical crisis now. We go from one crisis to another crisis these days. But it's interesting to see how people, for example, in a way, accept their situation, go with the flow, but then what was interesting was to see those moments of rupture. So, for example, in the case of Greece, many people in some of the peri-urban areas decided to buy stoves and fuel wood stoves, and to use them for cooking and for space heating. And after a while, they just got sick of them because they couldn't control the temperature. It's not that easy to use actually those fuel wood stoves just for cooking or for other energy services apart from space heating. So there were those moments kind of rupture where people actually show their, in a way, politics of refusal. They were not happy with these kind of technologies that were used as a compromise to deal with the situation. And they started even thinking more about how systemically to change the situation through collective agencies and through collective protests, rather than dealing with the situation in their homes only at the very much kind of household level.
really interesting. It's made me think of, we've been doing some work on how kind of access to energy services, how affordable warmth has been challenged or disrupted through COVID, and what's that meant for energy demand and energy demand in the home. But actually, there would be quite an interesting gender question there as well, and how, you know, with children being in the home when schools were closed, and who was responsible, especially if there's two parents in the home and both are working, how that might have shifted or disrupted some of the traditional gender roles or social norms that we might expect to see. So these kind of disruptive crises that we see are quite interesting focal points to examine some of these questions. But I'd not thought of the gender question in the COVID situation until now. But yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Usually situations of crisis or different crises, they enhance, they strengthen the kind of, you know, those traditional inequalities or traditional gendered inequalities. So we have some evidence, for example, from other projects and from other research that shows that during the COVID crisis as well, the role, kind of the expectations of what we consider to be women, like females, actually in the home, the expectations have increased, and that has in a way worsened the gendered inequalities in our society as well.
Thank you.
I think there is actually a question a little bit later, okay, but I think from Peter, so we'll maybe return to it in a moment. But I know we've got quite a lot of questions coming in, which is great, but there's one from Anna. I can't see everyone on my screen. So Anna, I don't know if you're still there and wanted to ask your question.
Hello, Saska, Neil, hello everybody. It's great listening to you. Sorry for my voice, it's from morning jogging. It's very cold here in Hungary. So it was really great to listen to you. And I think like Helen a little bit asked about this. So, and I really like how you concluded of that gender is a social construct, and how basically looking at the household level, what happened in regard to energy vulnerability, how it reflects the society as a whole. And I was wondering if you've had any insight about, it's not about this relationship between the genders in terms of division or regarding energy use, but how the society, how the household reflects already this existing gender roles in the society. For example, women earn less, or maybe they're unemployed, or maybe they're more taking care of the children, or maybe there is a widow who is lives long than her husband has passed away. And how, if notice any kind of links like that, and how this may, if any, informed your findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Neil, would you like me to go first now, or would you like to go
No,
first?
go ahead.
Whatever you prefer.
Go ahead, I'm happy for you to speak.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, from South Africa, what we saw is that actually kind of the binary understanding of gendered roles, and especially the focus of many development projects, that kind of aim to provide either help to women, because women were seen as almost as victims, as vulnerable, as rather passive in that sense, like just subjects with no agency almost, because they are just the receivers of the help, or these kind of expectations, especially in relation to energy transitions and low carbon energy transitions, in terms of like innovative energy solutions. Women are seen as, and this is not only in South Africa, but in some other contexts as well, women are seen as kind of like the leaders in the transition, very entrepreneurial. So basically that kind of binary thinking does not leave much space of alternative imaginaries in relation of how, for example, different genders can be involved in those low carbon energy transitions. So definitely, I mean, definitely we can see that kind of those broader kind of understandings of energy transitions, for example, can impact the gendered roles in the households and the expectations as well. So I think one trend that is quite positive these days is at least that the kind of the energy supply, energy production, energy supply, and energy demand are not divided that much. And that is like more of a recent trend, because previously, even when, for example, there were discussions on energy security or discussions on energy supply, the demand side was very much seen as a kind of like almost as a, in terms of like the economy and prices and stuff, rather than in these ideas around energy needs or energy expectations and so on.
Yeah, okay, just quickly, yeah, thanks, Anna, that's a really good question. So yes, I mean, in the case that I talked about, the case where we did the research in Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe as well, in Greece, yes, absolutely. So yeah, expected gender roles around energy poverty were very much kind of, in a way, they seem to kind of reflect these broader societal expectations, right, around gender roles, at least in the cases that we looked at. I mean, there was obviously exceptions, as we mentioned. So this idea that, you know, that household reproduction and caregiving is kind of feminized, and then household maintenance and provision is kind of masculinized, and then that was sort of reflected in the way how people respond to energy poverty, right? So women tended to be the ones that did the kind of everyday behavioral adaptations, and then they face that kind of emotional burden of that sometimes being in conflict with their expected caregiving role. And then, you know, the masculine element of energy efficiency and home maintenance. So yeah, that, broadly speaking, that was kind of those broader norms reflected in how people responded to energy poverty. And sometimes it's institutionalized as well. Your question made me think of one example I think we talk about in the paper, right? And it's around maternity leave. So in most countries, actually, in Europe, I think maternity leave is still something that is exclusively for mothers, basically. I know in the UK now we have shared paternity. You can do that. I don't know how many people do, but basically it's the expectation that when you have a baby, it's the mother that will stay at home for, you know, 9 months or a year, however long. And we had a case of someone in energy poverty, or a household in energy poverty, where basically what that institutionalized expectation meant was that they were the ones that were at home all day in this dark and cold apartment. So their exposure to the cold home was increased because of exactly this institutionalized norm around who it is that's going to stay at home and do the caregiving. So yeah, that was just an interesting example that your question brought to me. But yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. Pascal, did you want to ask your question about resistance?
Yes, just a second. I'll just put myself so you can actually see me from Helsinki. For some reason, it's not letting me start the video. Here we go. Sorry, it's a little bit dark. We actually are going into the evening here slowly. We have short days. So yes, I have a question. The first thing is that I wondered about the UK, since I'm originally British and French, and I don't live in the UK anymore, but this energy poverty thing is not new. And it always surprises me because I don't see it in the same extent in Finland. The idea of not being able to heat your home in Finland would probably cause, I don't know, riot because it gets cold here. But so we don't really have that. So I feel that the whole problem has been manufactured in a way in the UK, and I'm interested in the forces that have brought it there. And I'm also interested as well, people are poor and suffering in the UK, but what are people doing to actually say, you know, well, actually, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. I'm going to do something. And if that came out in the interviews or you know, I would be quite interested in hearing. And also in the talk by Saska, there was a mention about problems about if you are poor connecting to the energy supply, the electricity supply. But I guess the companies that provide that energy supply or who make the electricity, I guess, are probably male dominated. So there's another gender aspect there that wasn't mentioned. Well, I wouldn't say it wasn't mentioned explicitly, but I was also interested in hearing how that gender thing is actually made, that genderification is made. Yes, and of course, why hasn't the UK invested in things like district heating? Denmark has about the same climate as the UK, and they have district heating everywhere. That was another thing that came into my mind. If this energy poverty has been politically made for a very, very long time, and why, and if anybody has documented it or looked into it.
Well, thank you. I mean, those are great questions. I mean, to be honest, if anywhere in the UK, energy poverty has been actually taken into consideration for a very long time. And also there is a difference whether the issue has been recognized or not. So, for example, many European countries argued, politicians in many European countries argued for a long time that there is no energy or fuel poverty in their countries, including, for example, many Eastern European countries, but Germany, Scandinavian countries as well. And I mean, there is more and more evidence that there is energy poverty in those countries as well, but there is no political recognition. And in a way, sometimes that energy poverty can be hidden almost. So there is that issue, but in terms of district heating systems, I think it's been in the play for a while. There have been different discussions on the kind of the opportunities to develop different types of district heating systems in the UK as well. But why it hasn't been still developed as such, I think there are different reasons. First, the way in which kind of the energy system is governed and it's organized is quite different. So in each country, that system can be quite different. The mode of governance can be quite different. And that also, there are many issues around land use, the control of resources, what types of energy district heating systems are going to be promoted. Is it going to be waste to energy, like in many, for example, continental European countries, like for example in Sweden? Is it going to be based on gas? How is that aligned with climate change?
It could be heat pumps.
Sorry?
It could be district heating based on heat pumps. That's what they seem to be planning to be shifting to here in Helsinki, because obviously it has to be sustainable now with climate goals, but it's just that I mean, here in Finland, it doesn't, or other countries I've lived in the Nordics, it doesn't take that long to plan and build a district heating system. It's not really that complicated. And they also have zoning and whatever issues, but somehow in the UK, it doesn't seem very much on the political agenda. There are some councils that are doing it, but it just doesn't seem to have caught on.
Many things are not on the political agenda, but that's a different thing. And I think those questions are more for politicians rather than. I mean, we can actually discuss about the benefits that people can get from, district heating systems and so on. But let's not forget that sometimes those district heating systems can also create path dependencies as well, especially if they're not managed and constructed in a proper way. So, for example, we have some evidence, let's say, from the Czech Republic, where people who were dependent on a district heating system actually didn't get the quality. I think it was in Liberec, didn't get the quality of energy services that they expected, and basically they were entrapped in a system for which they paid quite a lot of money. So basically that system created further vulnerabilities. So I can hear you, and I can see many good benefits, but it's also about how that system is going to be built and how is that system going to be, is going to be managed and governed as well. But I agree.
Because I was also wondering, hearing the discussion on energy poverty in the UK and also by extension in other countries, was that by not having these kind of systemic level solutions of like district heating, I'm wondering if what has been happening in the UK is that we have been systematically gendificating. I'm sorry, but my English is going a little weird since I've been living in Finland. energy poverty, basically, because sure, I mean, here in Finland, there might be some problems with energy. Right now, there's a big debate about the projected increase in energy costs. But the way it's being articulated is more like, okay, what is it going to mean for our bills in terms of our charges in our apartments, since we pay monthly charges, for instance, and there's going to be a lot of debate about that. But it's not about whether we can put food on the table for the kids. And it's not about whether it's the man or the woman that pays the bill, because it doesn't seem to really be the way it comes through the whole way we live, basically, in terms of.
Pascal, those of us that identify as progressive or left of centre in the UK often look at Finland quite enviously, I think.
You shouldn't. There's plenty of problems here.
Probably problems, but yeah, I mean, we could talk.
I get pretty pissed at Finland is the least corrupt country in the world. That is so completely untrue. It's just that you don't see the corruption. It's not, here's a brown envelope to fix something. It's just like a lot of backhand stuff actually happened and has been written about. So
I don't want to truncate the conversation at all, but I'm conscious that we're getting towards the end
yeah,
of our
please,
time.
I'm just going to switch off.
So I was going to say, Hilman, and you were raising a paper that tackled some of the similar themes. I didn't know if you wanted to add to your comment in the chat at all. Hi.
Hi, everyone. Hi, it's almost 9:30 here, 9:30 p.m. here in Indonesia, where I live. So thanks so much, Saska and Neil, for the presentation. As someone who is interested in the issue of energy poverty and community energy, I'm a big fan of your work. So thank you so much for the presentation. Yeah, I think that I'm really interested in the presentation by Saska earlier about this sort of neoliberal, idea of empowerment in South Africa. And also I came across this paper in India written by Gregory Seaman about sort of the dominance of neoliberal inspired notion of gender empowerment. And I think coming from critical development studies perspective, this idea of neoliberal empowerment is particularly prevalent in rural energy projects in the global south. And yeah, I think in my current work in rural Indonesia, we also see sort of the similar pattern of the idea of integrating women into the market and all this kind of neoliberal inspired vision of what empowerment actually entails for women, how they are defined as being empowered. And there's a very, I think, narrow framing of what empowerment means for women and also for these people who are considered as this passive recipient of development. I guess I also have one more question about the idea of modernity. I mean, as someone who's doing research on energy access projects in the global south, there's a growing critical literature on criticizing the idea of modern energy. So the idea of modernity in energy itself. And I'm wondering if how does that, what will be the implications if we take the idea of modernity seriously in researching energy poverty, both in the global north and the global south? What will be the sort of the implications of, will that change our framework, or will that change our perspective of energy poverty when we take into account the sort of the critical perspective of modern energy that I think is, especially coming from the global south, that modernity perspective is very strong. It's often, explicitly mentioned in development policies, in NGO projects, modern electricity. Everybody needs to have modern electricity, and yeah, I think that, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts and your insights on that. Thank you once again.
Thank you. I can see that. I think. Okay. Yeah, John is still here. I mean, John, if you would like to join me, because we're talking about our joint paper as well. I feel weird talking about the paper that I co-wrote with you, and you're here as well. So thank you for showing your face. But I mean, please, if you have anything to add to the presentation or anything, please feel free, because I try to do it justice, but actually, you know, you're here as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a great question, Hilman. And I think what's probably embedded in your question is some of that critical literature that you mentioned that tries to differentiate between modernity, colonialism, and aspects of market rule, I think. And I think it's really difficult to tease those apart. And I think probably one of the useful things, the concepts that came from the presentation from both Saska and Neil today was this idea of socially and materially necessary energy services. And that's one set of concepts that we could use to assess what's distinct about modernity with respect to energy services, and what's not. So how do we understand, I mean, how do we differentiate between those socially and materially necessary energy services, and then how do we differentiate the modes of delivery of those? So I guess I could comment a little bit about Anna's question earlier. I think it was Anna who asked about certain like intra-household gender relations. And there is an example from South Africa that I actually think was quite relevant to Anna, insofar as there's a big system of social grants that's been introduced in South Africa over the last few years, in which indigent people, or people who can be specifically designated as in poverty, which includes elderly people who get state grants, have had a new role in the household, because essentially, to paraphrase another paper that I saw recently, households are having to negotiate with grandma, because grandma is now the source of income because of this system of grant distribution. And so this really does indicate how these different intersections of household energy, of urban planning, which we haven't discussed today, but it's in the paper, and infrastructure, and then systems of distribution and social reproduction intersect with the big questions about production. So that's one of the insights of the paper that we think is that really we need to be thinking about questions of production and social reproduction together, questions of consumption and production together when we try and analyze energy deprivation. And then the other is to go back to Hilman's point, is to think about what context in which this kind of energy entrepreneurialism that Saska has described emerges. And it's one in which municipal governments are searching for solutions, in South Africa at least, which are incredibly cheap because they don't have any money to dedicate to fixing an energy system. And it also has, to go back to Pascal's question, it's really shaped by the level of political decentralization in a political economy. So what role do the local government, who may govern a district heating system or be required to introduce it or to mediate some form of participation, what role do they actually have in governing energy in a country like Finland or a country like the UK? I don't know either of those countries well, but I think that level of political institutionalization and the form that it takes in the polity really factors very, very massively in those decisions. So we look at that level of entrepreneurialism that's promoted in South Africa as a policy response, and situate that within a political economy of municipal financing, of post-apartheid governance, in which the economy has been sort of reformulated away from a kind of racial Keynesianism to kind of pretty standard, what you might call neoliberal economy with a significant amount of state intervention and social support. So I guess a few examples that basically just emphasize our point of trying to think about the home as nested within multiple scales of governance, thinking about social reproduction and gender roles, but not necessarily just through social reproduction, also linked to productive systems in the economy. So thanks very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed your presentation of the first paper as well, Neil, and Saska, you did a great job presenting the second. Don't worry about that at all.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm conscious we're over how long we'd said we'd have for the session. There's a couple of questions left from Peter and myself. So if Peter's comfortable with that, I think we'll probably call it a day on the questions, because I'm sure people have other things they need to finish off at the tail end of a Friday. So another huge thank you to Neil and Saska, and for John for his contribution at the end as well. I think it was really widely enjoyed by everyone. Apart from thank yous, Peter, was there anything else you needed to add? I saw that you added the next webinar at the beginning of the chat, if anyone wants to sign up for that. Was there any other kind of admin thingies?
None at all. Just a reminder that I guess that these videos will be uploaded. They're all available on our website and on our YouTube channel. So if you want regular updates on that, get over to YouTube. Gosh, I sound old saying that. And just to second my thanks again to Neil, Saska, and also to John. It's been really great to kind of hear about this work today and to see just how kind of enthused people are about it, and see these really great conversations and questions. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope people have found this useful, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Cheerio.
Bye. Thank you.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.